The room was already dim when the photographer began to work. Candlelight touched the edges of furniture but refused to settle in the corners, as if the shadows had claimed them long before. Outside, winter pressed its weight against the windows, and inside, the parlor waited in a practiced stillness. This was the winter of 1899, in a town small enough that secrets learned how to breathe quietly. The house stood at its edge, neither fully inside nor completely apart, its bricks darkened by coal smoke and years of habits that were never discussed. Curtains were drawn early here, not because the light was gone, but because it was not always welcome. The parlor was narrow, arranged to look proper rather than comfortable, and every object seemed placed with care, not for beauty but for control. The photographer adjusted his wooden tripod, checked the brass fittings, and asked for stillness. He did not know that stillness already lived in the walls. The woman sat upright in the chair, her back straight, her chin held at a measured angle that suggested discipline learned young. Her hands were folded in her lap, fingers pressed together as if holding something invisible in place. She wore mourning black, heavy fabric that absorbed light rather than reflected it. The parish ledger recorded no recent death tied to her name, no loss that demanded such color, but the ledger did not record everything. It never had. Her face was calm, not soft, not hardened, but carefully arranged. It was the kind of expression worn by people who understood that appearances could be negotiated, managed, even defended if one tried hard enough. Beside her sat the child, small for his age, too still to be comfortable. His feet barely reached the floor, yet his shoes were polished until they caught the faint glow of the candle. His coat, however, told a quieter story. The sleeves were frayed at the cuffs, worn thin by time and mending. Care and neglect lived side by side on his small frame, neither fully winning. His eyes did not meet the lens. They fixed themselves somewhere beyond it, as if looking past the present moment into something already decided. The photographer's apparatus was patient. Wood, brass, and time. It asked nothing of the room but honesty, and it did not understand how rare that was. As the lens opened, it gathered more than faces. It gathered the weight of a house that had learned to survive by omission. On the mantel behind them sat letters tied with twine, their edges curled, their ink faded not from age alone but from hesitation. They had been written, folded, and set aside again and again, waiting for a courage that never arrived. No one spoke of them. No one needed to. Silence had a language of its own here, and everyone had learned it fluently. The photograph was meant to preserve respectability. It was meant to become proof. Proof that order existed. Proof that the household was intact. Proof that nothing was out of place. When the shutter closed, there was no sound loud enough to mark the moment. Just a small click, quickly swallowed by the room. The photographer packed his equipment, nodded politely, and stepped back into the cold. The house exhaled. Life returned to its quiet routine. Fires were tended, meals were taken, curtains were drawn. The photograph was developed, mounted, and stored. For years it was shown to visitors and passed between hands with mild pride. A mother and child, proper, composed, nothing unusual, and for a long time no one looked closely enough to disagree. It was only later, much later, when eyes unconnected to the family studied the image, that something unsettled began to surface. At first it was dismissed with ease. A trick of exposure, someone said, a chemical error, a shadow behaving badly. Old photographs were full of such imperfections and people had learned to forgive them. But this shadow resisted forgiveness. Behind the lace curtain where no one should have stood, there was a faint outline, not a blur, not a smear, an outline. It had shape, it had proportion. It suggested a presence that had weight, even if it lacked detail. The longer one looked, the less accidental it appeared. The shadow did not spill or drift. It held itself together as if aware of the space it occupied. The photograph did not reveal this quickly. It asked for time. Those who glanced at it saw nothing. Those who studied it began to feel watched. The outline stood slightly apart from the seated figures, close enough to belong, far enough to be denied. It was shaped like a person standing still, as if instructed not to move. The lace curtain softened it but did not erase it. The effect was subtle, unsettling in its restraint. The image did not scream its secret, it waited. And in that waiting lived a question that had never been asked aloud in the house itself. Who else had been present in that room, and why had their presence been denied? In 1899, respectability was not just a preference, it was a currency. It bought safety, silence, and a place in the narrow order of things. The woman understood this. She had learned early how easily a household could be judged, how quickly a reputation could fracture. Every gesture she made was measured against what it might suggest. Mourning black could mean many things. It could mean loss. It could mean seriousness. It could mean nothing at all if no one pressed the question. The parish ledger, neat and official, did not record the reason for her dress. It did not record what happened behind drawn curtains or inside rooms where words were weighed before being spoken. The child learned this language without being taught. Children always do. He learned that some questions made adults tense. He learned that certain names were never said. He learned that stillness was safer than curiosity. The house itself carried these lessons. Floors creaked, but only in certain places. Doors closed softly, trained by years of careful use. Even the air felt arranged. Objects were kept not for comfort but for order. The letters on the mantel remained tied, their contents known but unacknowledged. They were part of the room's quiet agreement. Written but not sent, present but not active. Like the shadow behind the curtain, they existed in a space between recognition and denial. When later generations encountered the photograph, they brought different eyes. They did not know the house. They did not owe it anything. They noticed the contradictions, the mourning without death, the care without completeness, the child's distant gaze. And the shadow, always the shadow. It resisted explanation in simple terms. Light did not behave that way without cause. The lace curtain, thin and patterned, should have scattered any outline into abstraction, but this shape held. It suggested intent. It suggested presence. The photograph began to change in meaning. No longer just a record of respectability, it became a question made visible. The mother's composed face took on a different tone when viewed alongside the shadow. Her folded hands looked less serene and more guarded. The child's gaze seemed heavier, as if he were already aware of something others had chosen to forget. The letters on the mantel, once background detail, became evidence of a pattern, writing without sending, knowing without naming. The photographer, long gone, had not noticed any of this. He had done his job. He had asked for stillness, and the room had given it freely. The camera, indifferent to intention, had recorded what was there. It did not understand respectability. It did not care about ledgers or reputations. It gathered light, and in doing so it gathered truth in its most patient form. The unexpected figure remained unnamed for years. It did not intrude. It did not demand attention. It simply existed within the frame, a quiet challenge to the story the photograph was meant to tell. Families can live for generations on stories that feel complete enough. This one did. The photograph was passed down, admired, explained, and then set aside. The shadow waited. There is a particular cruelty in denial that wears the face of order. It leaves no marks that can be easily pointed to. It does not bruise or break. It erases. It places people in rooms and then insists they were never there. The photograph captured the moment when that erasure was not yet complete. Someone stood behind the curtain. Someone was close enough to be seen, even if only faintly. Someone belonged to that moment, to that child, to that room. As time moved forward, the house aged, the town changed, and the people who had arranged the stillness passed into memory. But the image remained. Paper can be patient too. It held its secret without decay. And each time it was studied, the question returned, unchanged by years or explanation. Who else had been present in that room, and why had their presence been denied? The photograph offers no answer. It only reminds us that silence, once captured, does not fade easily. Some names remain unspoken, not because they lack meaning, but because speaking them would undo the order that was built to keep them hidden. And the image waits, calm and unyielding, for the moment when someone is ready to look without turning away. To understand the figure, one first had to understand the house, because the house was never just a building. It was an agreement. It stood with its narrow shoulders squared against the town, built from the wages and habits of a man who believed that obedience could be turned into safety. The woman's late husband had been a clerk, a position that demanded precision, patience, and the ability to disappear into paperwork without leaving a mark. He rose modestly, not through brilliance, but through compliance. He learned when to speak and when not to. He learned that records mattered more than stories, and that anything not written might as well not exist. The house reflected that belief. Its rooms were orderly, its surfaces clean, its corners quiet. It offered no invitation to linger, only instruction on how to behave. Respectability was the household's true inheritance. It was traded carefully, spent sparingly, and defended without mercy. Silence was the insurance that protected it. Servants understood this almost immediately. They moved quietly, steps measured, hands busy. They learned where to stand and where not to. Doorways were dangerous places, too visible, too open to questions. Questions themselves were a kind of trespass. Those who asked them did not last. The servants learned that staying employed meant staying unremarkable. They learned that the walls listened and that the safest words were the ones never spoken. The mother, widowed young, carried her grief like a document stamped and filed away. It was folded neatly inside her, official and unquestioned, but never read aloud. She did not weep in public. She did not rage. She performed mourning the way she performed everything else, with care and restraint. Her black dresses were pressed and plain. They signaled loss without inviting discussion. In a town that watched closely, this was considered strength. No one asked what she felt when the house fell quiet at night, or when the routines once shared became solitary. Feeling was private. Presentation was everything. Whispers followed her through the streets, though never loudly enough to be confronted. Rumors moved the way smoke does, thin and persistent. Some said a relative had once lived with them, a woman from the countryside, distant enough to explain unfamiliarity. Others spoke of a maid dismissed without reference, her name never mentioned again. There were stories of a debt settled quietly, not with money, but with favors that left no trace on paper. None of these whispers were complete on their own. Together they formed a shape that people sensed but never outlined. It was safer that way. The child grew within this atmosphere, breathing it in before he had words to describe it. He learned early that some things were never to be named. He learned to avert his eyes when adults lowered their voices, to make himself smaller in moments of tension. Absence became normal to him. People left, and no one explained why. Objects moved, and no one remarked on it. He accepted these shifts the way one accepts weather, as something beyond question. Injustice did not arrive with shouting or force. It arrived quietly through omission, through the careful removal of details that might complicate the story the house wanted to tell. There was a young woman who once slept in the attic room. The attic was not meant for comfort. Its ceiling sloped low, and the air was colder there, carrying the smell of dust and old wood. Her trunk was stored beneath the stairs, tucked out of sight but not discarded. She was said to be a cousin from the countryside, a phrase broad enough to avoid scrutiny. She worked when needed, helped when asked, and stayed mostly unseen. Her presence filled gaps without drawing attention to itself. The child saw her sometimes, moving quietly through the house, her face familiar but undefined. She smiled at him in a way that felt careful, as if joy itself needed permission. When she left, there was no announcement. One day her footsteps were gone. The attic room was empty. The trunk remained. Its contents were redistributed without comment, clothing folded and absorbed into drawers that already held too much. Small personal items placed where they might be mistaken for having always been there. The child noticed the absence before he noticed anything else. He waited for an explanation that never came. When he asked, gently, he was told she had gone back to where she belonged. No place was named. Belonging, he learned, could be reassigned. The household ledger remained immaculate. It recorded wages paid, repairs made, cold deliveries received. It listed dates and amounts with neat precision. It did not record the young woman's departure. It did not record her presence either. On paper, she had never been there at all. The ledger was the house's memory, and it remembered only what it was designed to hold. Everything else was left to fade. This was the period of quiet rearrangement, when moral blindness disguised itself as propriety. Nothing appeared wrong because nothing appeared at all. The routines continued. Meals were served, floors were scrubbed, curtains were drawn. The mother maintained her composure, the servants their silence, the child his careful watchfulness. The house functioned smoothly, like a machine that had learned how to remove its own excess parts without leaving marks. It was during this time that the photograph was taken. The camera arrived without judgment, without understanding of hierarchy or consequence. It did not know which lives were meant to be visible and which were meant to remain in shadow. It only gathered light. In doing so, it recorded what the family refused to acknowledge. The unexpected figure lingered behind the lace curtain because that was where such lives were kept, close enough to serve, far enough to deny. The shadow was not dramatic. It did not announce itself. It simply occupied space quietly, the way the young woman always had. Silence protected the living. It allowed the mother to move through town without open accusation. It allowed the child to grow without scandal attached to his name. It allowed the servants to keep their positions. But silence also fed something heavier. It pressed down on the child's gaze, teaching him that knowing and speaking were not the same thing. He sensed that something had been taken from the world and hidden. He felt it in the way adults paused before answering certain questions. He felt it in the way rooms felt emptier than they should. He felt it in the way the house seemed to hold its breath, The child did not have language for this. He only had sensation, a tightness in the chest when he passed the attic stairs, a pull of attention toward the trunk beneath them, a feeling that the house was complicit in something that could not be undone. Complicity did not require action, it required agreement. And the house agreed every day by continuing as if nothing had happened. Years later, people would speak of cruelty as if it always announced itself loudly. They would look for signs of anger, violence, or clear malice. But cruelty often wears softer clothing. It blends into routine. It hides behind good manners and careful records. In this house, injustice wore the face of order. It asked for nothing but cooperation, and everyone in their own way provided it. The mother believed she was protecting her child. The servants believed they were protecting their livelihoods. The town believed it was protecting its sense of decency. Each belief was sincere enough to prevent doubt, yet sincerity did not undo harm, it only made it quieter. The young woman's life was folded into the household and then removed, her story absorbed and erased at the same time. The child carried the weight of that erasure without understanding its source. When the photograph captured the shadow behind the curtain, it froze this moment of moral compromise. It held it in place, patient and unchanging. The figure remained there, neither fully seen nor fully hidden. It became a question the house never answered aloud: who belonged here, who was allowed to be remembered, and who was expected to disappear without leaving a mark. The child's gaze in the photograph holds that question. It is not accusation, it is recognition without language. He looks past the lens, past the present, as if sensing that the truth will outlast the silence built to contain it. The house, for all its careful order, cannot fully erase what it once held. Some absences are too heavy to vanish. Some shadows remain, waiting for someone to notice that they were never supposed to be there, and to ask why they are. Decades passed before the photograph was seen again, decades in which the child grew into a man and the mother's name was carved into stone with careful lettering. Time softened the edges of memory, but it did not erase them. The image resurfaced quietly, as many truths do, inside an archive box that smelled of dust and old glue, the kind of box that had not been opened in years because nothing urgent was believed to live inside it. The cardboard was soft at the corners. The label was fading. It rested among hundreds of other domestic portraits, all claiming ordinariness, all asking for nothing more than a brief glance before being returned to their sleep. A historian found it by accident while cataloging faces that no longer had voices. The room was silent except for the slow turning of paper and the distant tick of a clock that had been wound out of habit rather than necessity. Light fell across the table in a thin, pale line, and the photograph lay within it as if waiting for permission to be seen. At first glance it was familiar: a mother, a child, a narrow parlor, the kind of image that filled albums and drawers across the country. But something interrupted that familiarity. The historian paused. The shadow behind the curtain refused to settle into explanation. It did not behave like light should. It did not blur or scatter. It held its shape. The historian leaned closer, bringing the image nearer to the lamp. Years of looking had trained the eye to notice small things. This was not damage. This was not chance. The shadow had proportion. It had posture. It suggested a body standing still, angled slightly inward. Behind the curtain stood a woman. Her outline was faint, softened by lace and age, but resolute. Her head inclined not toward the lens, but toward the child. The gesture was subtle, almost tender. It was not the stance of someone caught unaware. It was the stance of someone watching over. That was when the photograph stopped being a curiosity and became a question. The historian felt it settle into the room, changing the air. Who was she? Why was she there? And why had no record ever mentioned her? The answers were not in the photograph alone. They waited elsewhere, patient as paper can be. The search moved from image to inventory, from catalog to storage. Names were traced, addresses matched. The house was identified. Its records were thin but intact, enough to follow. The trail led to a municipal depot on the outskirts of town, a place built to hold what no one wanted to keep close. Inside, shelves sagged beneath the weight of trunks, crates, and forgotten belongings, all tagged and numbered, all separated from their stories. The air was colder there, carrying the smell of metal and neglect. An inventory number matched the old house. Beneath the stairs, a trunk had once been kept. The trunk was found here now, its leather cracked, its lock rusted. No one had opened it in years. Inside were letters. They were folded carefully, stacked with intent rather than disorder. The paper was brittle, the ink faded, but the handwriting remained precise. It was a careful hand, practiced and restrained. The dates reached back years before the photograph. The letters spoke softly, but they spoke clearly. They told of service that slowly turned into dependence, of staying because leaving felt impossible, of promises made in whispers then withdrawn politely as if politeness could soften betrayal. There was no bitterness in the words, only exhaustion. One letter had never been sent. It was addressed but unfinished, the final lines trailing off as if the writer had run out of permission to continue. In it, the woman confessed to a child born in secrecy, a child raised under another name, a child kept close enough to watch but too far to claim. The reason was written plainly without accusation, to preserve a household's honor, to protect respectability, to avoid ruin. These words appeared again and again, not as justification but as explanation. The letter did not ask for forgiveness. It only asked to be read. The unexpected figure in the photograph was not a ghost. She was not a trick of light. She was the erased caretaker, the true mother, present but unrecognized. The photograph had caught her at the threshold of erasure, standing where she still belonged, even as the world prepared to forget her. The historian sat with this knowledge in the quiet of the depot, the letters spread across a metal table, the image resting beside them. The alignment was immediate and heavy. Nothing needed to be forced into place. The facts settled with a solemn calm, as if relieved to finally rest where they fit. The child's distant gaze in the photograph changed meaning in that moment. What once looked like distraction now looked like awareness. He had known her presence even when the world denied it. Children know more than they are credited for. They learn truths without names, understand bonds without permission. He had felt her watching him from behind the curtain, had carried that knowledge quietly because that was how things were done in the house. Knowing did not grant him the power to change anything. It only taught him how to endure. The revelation did not arrive as scandal. There were no headlines, no public outrage, no names dragged into judgment. It arrived as clarity, as alignment, as the simple act of placing one truth beside another and seeing that they belong together. The oppressor's respectability thinned, not through accusation but through understanding. It became clear how easily order had been maintained, how gently injustice had been administered, how thoroughly a life could be erased without raising a voice. The historian wrote carefully. Notes were added to the archive record. The photograph was relabeled. The woman in shadow was given her name back, though only in pencil at first, as if caution still lingered. The letters were preserved, sleeved, and indexed. They joined the image as part of the same story, no longer separated by silence. This was not an act of correction. It was an act of acknowledgement. Outside the archive, the town had changed. The house no longer stood. Streets had been renamed. The people who once whispered were gone, yet the patterns they lived by remained familiar. Respectability still carried weight. Silence still offered protection. The difference was that now the truth had been placed somewhere it could be found. It did not demand attention. It did not insist on being seen. It simply existed, waiting for eyes willing to look without turning away. There is a particular stillness that follows understanding. It is not relief. It is not sorrow. It is the moment when a story stops resisting itself. The historian felt it while closing the box, while turning off the lamp, while leaving the room to its quiet. The photograph would no longer sleep unnoticed. It would not be displayed prominently. It would not become famous. But it would be honest. Truth does not always arrive in time to change outcomes. The woman behind the curtain never spoke her name aloud in that room. The child grew without being claimed. The mother died with her composure intact. None of that could be undone, but truth does not exist only to repair. Sometimes it exists to witness. To say this happened, this life was here, this presence mattered. The photograph now carries that weight openly. The shadow no longer reads as an accident. It reads as a presence that refused to disappear completely. The letters speak not of anger but of endurance, of a woman who stayed long enough to watch her child grow even if she could never step fully into the light. History often remembers the loudest moments, revolutions, declarations, crises, but there are other memories, quieter ones held in paper and shadow. They wait for patience rather than passion. They ask for attention rather than outrage. When they are finally seen, they do not shout. They stand. The image remains unchanged, but the silence around it has shifted. It is no longer empty. It is filled with context, with understanding, with the soft gravity of truth unearthed, too late to save, but not too late to matter. Some names only find peace once the truth is spoken, even if it is spoken in a room where only paper and dust are listening. The house did not survive the decade. By the early 1930s, its bricks were deemed inefficient, its narrow rooms unsuitable for modern work, its silence unproductive. Men arrived with plans rolled under their arms and language that spoke of progress as if it were a neutral force. Walls were measured, windows were marked. What had once been a private world was reduced to figures and timelines. When the demolition began, there was noise for the first time in years. Stone broke, wood split. Dust rose and settled everywhere, carrying traces of lives that had learned how to stay quiet. Within weeks, the house was gone, replaced by offices that hummed with typewriters and footsteps that did not pause to remember what had stood there before. Progress moved forward without looking back, confident that whatever mattered would have found a way to keep up. Yet the photograph endured. Paper is lighter than brick, but it lasts longer when handled with care. It had been moved from drawer to box, from box to shelf, surviving by accident at first, then by intention. Now it rested in an archive properly labeled, its context restored in neat handwriting that did not rush. The image was no longer anonymous. It was no longer misfiled under assumptions. The woman in shadow was given her name back in the margins, written carefully, as if the archivist understood that even ink could carry respect. Her story was appended without flourish. No dramatic language, no condemnation, just facts placed where they belonged. No public apology followed. There were no ceremonies, no statements issued on heavy paper. None was needed. The act of acknowledgement itself shifted the weight of memory. What had once pressed down invisibly was now redistributed, balanced by understanding. The photograph no longer carried its burden alone. It was supported by context, by words that explained without excusing. In the quiet of the archive, this was enough. Justice did not arrive as spectacle. It arrived as accuracy. Visitors who came across the image felt it almost immediately. The same quiet unease that had once lingered without explanation now transformed into recognition. People stood longer than they meant to. They leaned closer, noticing the shadow not as a flaw, but as a presence. The mother's posture read differently now. The child's distant gaze softened into something like awareness. And behind them, the woman in shadow no longer felt unsettling. She felt familiar, human, someone you might have known without realizing it. The child's descendants learned this story slowly, through records rather than rumors. Names that had once appeared only on stones or in ledgers now carried fuller meaning. They learned that their lineage included not just respectability but sacrifice, not just order but endurance. This knowledge did not undo the past. It did not rewrite childhoods or return stolen years, but it altered the shape of inheritance. It allowed memory to hold more than one truth at the same time. In the town, the church bell still rang. It no longer tolled for that household alone. It rang for strangers, for schedules, for reasons detached from the lives once lived nearby. Sound carries, but meaning shifts. History had already marked the balance long before the bell changed its rhythm. The house was gone, but the silence it had cultivated had not disappeared entirely. It lingered in habits, in stories half told, in the way people still learned which questions were safe to ask. The difference was that now, one silence had been broken gently, without force. The unexpected figure no longer hid in darkness. She occupied her rightful place in the narrative, neither villain nor saint, but human. She was not elevated into purity, nor reduced to tragedy. She was recognized as someone who lived within constraints she did not design, who made choices shaped by power she did not hold. Her presence in the photograph was no longer an intrusion. It was evidence. Evidence that life does not always align with the stories built to contain it. The photograph taught its final lesson without ceremony. It did not demand interpretation. It did not insist on emotion. It simply existed, complete now in a way it had never been before. Time had blurred faces and softened ink, but it had preserved what power tried to forget. The image reminded those who looked that erasure is rarely total. Something always remains. A shadow, a letter, a glance that does not quite look where it is told. Archives are quiet places, but they are not empty. They hold the residue of choices made and unmade. They wait. The photograph waited for decades without complaint. It did not age into irrelevance. It aged into readiness. When the moment came, it offered what it had always held. Not accusation, not forgiveness, presence. There is a tendency to believe that truth must arrive loudly to matter, that it must disrupt, overturn, punish. But some truths move differently. They settle. They adjust the way a story sits in the mind. They change the weight of names. They allow memory to breathe. This was one of those truths. It did not seek revenge. It sought visibility. The woman's name, once confined to a margin, now lives where it can be found. Not celebrated, not hidden, simply placed. Her life no longer exists only as a problem to be managed or a secret to be kept. It exists as part of the record, which is where it always belonged. The child's story, too, changes in this light. His silence reads not as absence but as survival. His gaze, once distant, now feels full. The offices that replaced the house have already been renovated more than once. Carpets changed, walls repainted, machines replaced by quieter ones. Progress continues, indifferent as ever. But beneath it all, in a box that smells faintly of dust and glue, the photograph remains. It does not compete with the present. It does not ask to be relevant. It waits, confident that someone someday will need what it offers. History is often described as a record of events, but it is also a record of what people tried to bury. But they hid behind manners, ledgers, and silence. Every so often something surfaces, not to accuse but to remind. This photograph does that work now. Quietly, patiently. Some names do not seek revenge. They seek visibility. They seek to be placed where they can be seen without distortion. And some stories only rest when the truth steps fully into the light, reminding us that history itself remembers what people tried to bury, even when the houses are gone and the bells ring for someone else.